In the summer of 216 BC, on the flat lands of southern Italy, something happened that would forever change how we think about military planning. An army of 80,000 Roman soldiers, the biggest army Rome had ever put together, marched forward, feeling sure they would win. These men represented the power of Rome, their training, their organization, and the strong force that had won land after land. They believed they were better than everyone else, that their armies couldn't be beaten, and that they would definitely win. But within just a few hours, this army would be completely destroyed. Not by a bigger force, not by better weapons, but by something far more powerful, an idea. A plan so smart and so perfectly done that even today, more than 2,000 years later, it is studied in armies around the world. This is the story of the Battle of Cannae and of the secret weapon that destroyed the largest army Rome had ever built. If you enjoy fascinating stories about strategy, war, and military genius, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. To truly understand what happened on that important day in August, we need to go back a few years. We need to understand who the players in this deadly game were, what they wanted, and how they got to that crucial moment in history. Rome in the 3rd century BC was a growing power. It had spread its control throughout the Italian peninsula through a mix of military force, smart deal-making, and an amazing ability to bring conquered peoples into its political system. The Roman legions were thought to be almost unbeatable. Their organization was better than any other military force at the time. Divided into smaller groups called maniples, centuries, and cohorts, Roman soldiers fought with strict discipline and teamwork that turned thousands of individual men into a single war machine. But Rome was not alone in the Mediterranean. Across the sea, on the north coast of Africa, was another power, Carthage. This Phoenician city-state had built a trading empire that stretched across the western Mediterranean. Carthage controlled important sea routes, had colonies on the Iberian Peninsula rich in silver and other resources, and had developed a navy that matched any other at the time. For many years, Rome and Carthage had lived in tense peace, each respecting the other's area of control. But as often happens when two great powers share the same space, fighting was bound to happen. The first war between Rome and Carthage started in 264 BC and would last 23 bloody years. This war, called the First Punic War, was fought mostly at sea and in Sicily. Rome, which had traditionally been a land power, was forced to build a navy from nothing. And against all odds, it managed to defeat Carthage at sea. The defeat was embarrassing for the Carthaginians. They were forced to pay a huge amount of money, lost Sicily and later Sardinia and Corsica. More than that, they lost their pride and their reputation for being unbeatable at sea. But in Carthage, one family had not forgotten this defeat, the Barca family, and one man in particular, Hannibal Barca. Hamilcar had been one of Carthage's most successful generals during the First Punic War. He had never been defeated in battle, but Carthage had still lost the war. The embarrassment weighed heavily on him. According to Roman historians, when his oldest son was only 9 years old, Hamilcar took him to an altar and made the boy promise to hate Rome forever. This boy was named Hannibal Barca. Hamilcar took his family to the Iberian Peninsula, where he began building a new empire for Carthage. He conquered local tribes, set up silver mines that would pay for future armies, and created an independent power base. When Hamilcar died in battle, his son-in-law took command. And when he too was killed, the Carthaginian army in Iberia did something extraordinary. They elected Hamilcar's son, a young man of just 25, as their commander. Hannibal Barca had grown up in military camps. He spoke several languages, understood different cultures, and had learned the art of war from his father and on the battlefields of Iberia. But more than that, he had something rare, a brilliant strategic mind and an ability to see the battlefield not as it was, but as it could be. The Second Punic War began in 218 BC when Hannibal attacked the city of Saguntum, an ally of Rome. Rome declared war. Everyone expected the war would be fought in Iberia and possibly Africa if Rome managed to invade Carthaginian territory. But Hannibal had other plans. In one of the boldest military moves in history, he decided to invade Italy, not by sea, where Rome was now strong, but by land, by a route considered impossible. He would march his army through Gaul and across the Alps. Imagine the scene, an army of about 50,000 men, including Iberian and African foot soldiers, Numidian cavalry considered the best in the world, and something Europe had never seen in such numbers, 37 war elephants. These giants would be used not only as weapons but also as tools to scare their enemies. The journey across the Alps was terrible. Gallic tribes attacked the Carthaginian columns. Snow and ice killed men and animals. Avalanches destroyed entire sections of the army. When Hannibal finally came down onto the Po plain in northern Italy, he had lost nearly half his army. But he was in Italy. He had done the impossible. Rome was shocked. Roman strategy had been completely turned upside down. Now the war would not be fought in distant territory, but in the very heart of Italy. Hannibal immediately got to work on his true goal, to break up the Italian Confederacy. Rome controlled Italy not only by military force, but through a complex network of alliances. If Hannibal could convince Rome's allies to switch sides, the Republic would collapse from within. To do this, he needed to prove that Rome was not unbeatable. He needed to defeat the legions over and over to destroy the myth of Roman superiority. And that's exactly what he began to do. At the Battle of the Trebia River in 218 BC, Hannibal faced a Roman consular army and destroyed it. He used a classic trap, luring the legions across an icy river and then attacking their sides with cavalry and hidden troops. Rome lost most of its army but sent new legions. The Romans didn't understand that they were facing no ordinary general. The following year, Hannibal marched south through Etruria. The Roman consul Gaius Flaminius followed him with his legions, determined to stop the Carthaginian from damaging more Roman territory. Hannibal carefully chose his battlefield, Lake Trasimene. On a foggy morning, he hid his army in the hills around the lake and waited. When Flaminius marched his legions through the narrow pass by the lake, Hannibal attacked from all sides at once. It was a massacre. 15,000 Romans died, including the consul himself. Another 15,000 were captured. The army simply stopped existing. Rome panicked. For the first time in decades, the city was genuinely threatened. The Senate appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, giving him absolute power to deal with the crisis. Fabius put in place a strategy that would be named after him, the Fabian strategy. He refused to face Hannibal in open battle. Instead, he followed the Carthaginian army from a safe distance, harassing their supply lines, attacking isolated groups, and cutting off their resources. It was a strategy of wearing down the enemy, designed to exhaust Hannibal without risking another disaster. And it worked, at least partly. Hannibal was in Italy but isolated. He received no major reinforcement from Carthage, which was dealing with its own problems in Iberia and Africa. His allies in Italy were few. He needed a decisive victory, something so devastating that it would break Rome's will to continue the war. But Fabius would not give him that chance. The months turned into more than a year of movements and counter-movements without a big battle. The problem was that Fabius's strategy, while working militarily, was politically impossible to maintain. Rome was a warrior republic. Its culture and identity were built on glorious military victories. The idea of simply following the enemy without fighting was seen as cowardice by many. The Roman nobles wanted glory. They wanted triumphs. They wanted to defeat Hannibal in open battle and prove the superiority of the legions. The Fabian strategy was called cowardly and UN Roman. When Fabius's term as dictator ended, there was huge pressure to change strategy. In the year 216 BC, two new consuls were elected, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Varro was a populist, a man of the people who had promised to give Rome the glorious victory it deserved. Paulus was more cautious, a seasoned aristocrat who had learned from Fabius. But even Paulus was under pressure. The Senate gave the consul something never done before, a massive army, 8 full legions, each with about 5,000 men, plus an equal number of Italian allies. In total, 86,000 men, the largest military force Rome had ever put together. This army was bigger than anything Hannibal could face. The logic was simple. Since they could not outmaneuver Hannibal, they would crush him with sheer numbers. The two consuls marched south toward Hannibal. According to Roman tradition, the consuls took turn commanding the army each day. This arrangement, which worked well under normal circumstances, would be disastrous against a tactical genius like Hannibal. Varro was aggressive, eager for battle. Paulus was cautious, remembering the lessons of Trasimene. This division of command would be exploited. Hannibal, meanwhile, was camped near the city of Cannae in the Apulia region of southern Italy. He had captured the Roman supply depot there, giving him valuable resources. More importantly, he had carefully chosen the ground where he wanted to fight. The plains around Cannae were perfect for cavalry, and cavalry was where Hannibal held a clear advantage over the Romans. He knew the Romans would come. They had to come. Political pressure, the thirst for glory, the size of the army, all pushed Rome toward a big battle. When the armies met, Hannibal had about 50,000 men. The Romans had 86,000. The difference was huge. In any direct fight, line against line, Rome should have won simply by having more men. But Hannibal wasn't planning a direct fight. He was about to use something that would completely change the rules of the game, something the Romans had never seen before on that scale. A weapon not made of metal or wood, but of geometry and human psychology. In the days before the battle, there were small fights between the two armies. Paulus, when in command, kept the army on defense. Varro, when it was his day, pushed forward aggressively, trying to get Hannibal to fight. The Roman soldiers were confident. They looked at their own ranks, saw 8 legions, saw their allies, saw the largest army Rome had ever put together, and knew they would win. How could they lose? They were more numerous, better equipped, and they fought for Rome. The night before the battle, Paulus reportedly tried to convince Varro to wait for better ground, for a more helpful position. But Varro was determined. This was his day of command, and he would give Rome its victory. On the morning of August 2nd, 216 BC, the Roman army lined up for battle. The traditional Roman formation placed the heavy infantry in the center, organized into legions. The Italian allies were on the wings. The Roman cavalry, relatively weak compared to the Carthaginian, was on the outer flanks. Varro, knowing he had numerical superiority in infantry, did something unusual. He narrowed the front and increased the depth of his legions. Instead of the usual formation, he created a massive column of infantry in the center. The logic was clear: use weight and numerical strength to simply crush the center of Hannibal's army through brute force. Across the field, Hannibal was forming his own army in a way his officers had never seen before. He placed his heavy African infantry on the wings, keeping them slightly back. These were experienced troops, veterans of many battles, equipped with weapons and armor captured from the Romans in previous victories. In the center, he placed his Gallic and Iberian infantry, less experienced and less well-equipped. And then he did something extraordinary. Instead of keeping a straight line, he formed the center into a curved arc bulging toward the Romans. It looked like a weak, vulnerable formation. The Carthaginian heavy cavalry under Hasdrubal was on the left flank. The Numidian cavalry, light and quick, was on the right flank. To any casual observer, Hannibal's formation looked strange, even flawed. The bulging center seemed to invite an attack, and that was precisely the point. Hannibal was creating bait. He knew exactly what the Romans would do. He had studied the Roman way of fighting. He knew they would advance in a straight line with their heavy infantry. He knew they would try to crush his weak center, and he was counting on it. The two armies began to advance. The clash of infantry in the center was huge. Thousands of men, armored in metal, carrying swords and spears, collided in a mass of violence. The noise must have been deafening. The clash of metal against metal, the screams of the wounded, the orders shouted by officers trying to keep formation. The Roman infantry, heavy and powerful, immediately began to push back the Carthaginian center. The Gauls and Iberians, facing the weight of several legions, began to retreat. But this was not a chaotic retreat. It was controlled, deliberate. The outward bulging arc was slowly turning into an inward curving one. Meanwhile, on the flanks, something crucial was happening. The Carthaginian heavy cavalry under Hasdrubal attacked the Roman cavalry on the left flank. The difference in quality was immediate and brutal. The Roman cavalry, made up mostly of wealthy citizens fighting more out of duty than skill, was quickly beaten. Many fled the field. Hasdrubal then did something that would show his own tactical genius. Instead of chasing the runners, he kept his cavalry together and led them behind the entire Roman army to attack the allied cavalry on the other flank. The allies, now attacked from both sides, were also defeated. In the center, the infantry battle continued. The Romans were winning, or at least they thought so. The Carthaginian center continued to retreat. Hannibal's formation had now changed from an outward bulging arc to an inward curving arc. The Romans, seeing the enemy retreat, pressed even harder. More legions were pushed forward. The Roman formation, already narrow, became even more squeezed. Tens of thousands of men were now packed into an ever-shrinking space. The soldiers in the back ranks pushed those in front. It was becoming difficult even to raise their weapons in such a tight space. The Romans' own numerical superiority was becoming a problem. And then came the critical moment. The heavy African infantry, which had stayed on the wings, slightly pulled back, suddenly turned 90 degrees and attacked the exposed sides of the Roman legions at the same time from both sides. The Romans, squeezed into the center, suddenly found themselves attacked from 3 directions. But it was not over yet. Hasdrubal, having defeated both wings of the Roman cavalry, brought his heavy cavalry behind the Roman lines and began attacking the rear. The trap had been completely sprung. 86,000 Roman soldiers were now trapped in an ever-shrinking space, attacked from all sides. There was nowhere to retreat. There was no way to maneuver. The very density of the Roman formations, which should have been their strength, became their doom. The men could not fight properly. They could not even run away. They were pressed against each other so tightly that when a man fell, he often could not even reach the ground, held up by the bodies around him. What followed was not a battle but a mass killing. For hours, Hannibal's troops methodically killed the Roman legions. Ancient historians describe horrible scenes, men suffocating under the weight of other bodies, soldiers so desperate they tried to bury themselves in the earth to escape, blood running in rivers across the countryside. Some Romans tried to fight to the end, forming small circles of resistance. Others tried to run, but the Carthaginian cavalry was there to chase them. Most simply died where they stood, unable to do anything else. The consul Paulus died fighting, refusing to leave the field while his legion still existed. Vero, the other consul, managed to escape with a few horsemen. Of the 86,000 Roman soldiers who entered the battle that day, about 55,000 never left. 10,000 were captured. Only about 20,000 managed to escape. It was the greatest military defeat Rome had ever suffered, the greatest disaster in Roman history. Hannibal's losses, about 6,000 men, mostly Gauls and Iberians from the center who had withstood the initial Roman attack. It was almost unbelievable. An army of 50,000 had destroyed an army of 86,000, and the weapon that made this possible wasn't some secret technology. It wasn't a special type of sword or armor. It was something far more devastating. It was a double envelopment, the maneuver that is now known as a pincer movement of Cannae. Hannibal had used the Romans' own aggression against them. He had turned their numerical superiority into a weakness. He had created a situation where the more the Romans pressed forward, the more vulnerable they became. Each Roman soldier who advanced to the center was actually helping to close the trap on himself. It was a masterpiece of military geometry, of psychology, of pure strategic genius. News of the defeat reached Rome and caused absolute panic. The Senate held an emergency meeting. It was believed that Hannibal would march on Rome itself and destroy the city. Roman women were forbidden from publicly mourning their dead because there were so many dead that public mourning could completely undermine the city's morale. Almost every noble Roman family had lost someone at Cannae. 70 senators died on the battlefield. It was a disaster on a scale Rome had never experienced. But then something extraordinary happened. Hannibal didn't march on Rome. His officers begged him to do so. Hannibal, his cavalry commander, reportedly said, "You know how to win, Hannibal, but you don't know how to use victory." But Hannibal knew something his officers didn't. He had no siege equipment. Rome was heavily defended. And more importantly, his strategic goal was not to capture Rome but to break the Italian Confederacy. And to do so, he needed Rome's allies to switch sides. And some did. Capua, Italy's second-largest city, joined Hannibal. Several southern cities did as well. But it wasn't enough. Most of Rome's allies, shocked by the scale of the defeat, remained loyal. And Rome, in its darkest hour, showed why it had become a great power. The Senate refused to consider peace. It refused to pay ransom for prisoners. It even refused to negotiate. Instead, it immediately began recruiting new armies. Rome had something Hannibal didn't, a nearly endless supply of manpower. For every legion destroyed, Rome could raise another. What followed were years of wearing-down warfare. Hannibal remained in Italy for 15 years after Cannae, but he was never able to repeat that decisive victory. Rome went back to the Fabian strategy, avoiding pitched battles, harassing Carthaginian supply lines, slowly regaining territory. And then Rome did something brilliant. It opened new fronts. It sent armies into Iberia to cut off Hannibal's power base there. It invaded Africa itself, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal to defend his homeland. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, Hannibal would finally be defeated by Scipio Africanus, a Roman general who had carefully studied Cannae's tactics and learned from them. But the legacy of Cannae went beyond that specific war. The battle became the gold standard of the enveloping maneuver, the perfect example of how superior tactics can overcome numerical superiority. For over 2,000 years, generals have studied Cannae. The Germans in World War II tried to copy it on a large scale with their blitzkrieg tactics. Modern armies still teach the principles of Cannae, the use of a flexible center to absorb the enemy's attack, the perfect timing of flank attacks, the importance of superior cavalry or mobile units, and the exploitation of the enemy's psychological tendencies. Hannibal's genius at Cannae was in understanding not only the physical battlefield but also the mental battlefield. He understood that the Romans, confident in their numerical superiority, would aggressively press his center. He understood that he could use his aggression to create the tactical situation he wanted. He turned the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. His inferior infantry in the center became an advantage because they could retreat flexibly while the Roman heavy infantry could not. Roman numerical superiority became a problem when all these men were squeezed into a space where they could not fight effectively. But there's a deep irony in the story of Cannae. Despite having engineered one of the most perfect tactical victories in history, Hannibal lost the war. Because wars aren't won only by brilliant tactics and individual battles. They are won by long-term strategy, resources, political will, and diplomacy. Rome had all of these. Carthage, despite having the greatest military genius of the age, did not. Rome could absorb the loss of 80,000 men and continue fighting. Carthage could not provide Hannibal with the resources he needed to take advantage of his victories. The real lesson of Cannae isn't just about tactical envelopment. It's about the difference between tactical victory and strategic victory. It's about how one side can win every battle and still lose the war. It's about resilience, about a nation's ability to absorb terrible disasters and keep fighting. Rome lost 70,000 men in a single day and not only survived but eventually won the war and became the dominant power in the Mediterranean for the next 6 centuries. As we look back through the centuries, Cannae stands as proof of what is possible when tactical genius meets a perfect moment. But it is also a reminder that even the most perfect victory can fall short without the larger strategic context. The secret weapon that destroyed 80,000 Romans that August day was not magic. It was careful thought, detailed planning, a deep understanding of human psychology and battlefield dynamics. It was the ability to see what others could not, to imagine a possibility that seemed impossible, and then execute it perfectly. Today, when military strategists study Cannae, they are not just learning about ancient formations or outdated tactics. They are learning fundamental principles that go beyond time and technology, the importance of understanding your enemy, the value of flexibility over rigidity, the power to transform an opponent's strengths into weaknesses, the need for perfect coordination between different elements of military force. These principles are as relevant today as they were over 2,000 years ago. The Battle of Cannae is studied not because we should copy exactly what Hannibal did, but because we should learn to think as he did. The true secret weapon was not the double envelopment itself, but the mind that conceived it. It was Hannibal's ability to see the battlefield not as a physical space where two armies collided, but as a geometric problem to be solved, as a psychological puzzle where the pieces were human beings with predictable tendencies. He saw that if he created the right conditions, the Romans would move exactly as he wanted. And they did. There is something deeply human in this story. The Roman soldiers who marched onto the battlefield that day were not fools. They were not cowards. They were brave, well-trained men fighting for their country. But they were defeated not for lack of courage or skill, but because they faced something they had never encountered before, a tactical genius at the height of his powers executing a perfect plan. There was no shame in being defeated by Hannibal at Cannae. There was only tragedy. For the survivors, the memories of that day must have been haunting. The sweltering heat of the Italian summer, the dust kicked up by hundreds of thousands of feet, the initial shock as the lines collided, the growing realization that something was terribly wrong, the panic as they saw enemies on all sides, the impossibility of escape, the the choice between dying fighting or dying trying to escape, and for the few who escaped, survivor's guilt, the shame of having fled while so many others died. Varro, the consul who had commanded the army that day, was largely blamed for the defeat. But the truth is more complex. Yes, he made mistakes. His narrow and deep formation played into Hannibal's hands. His desire for a quick and glorious victory blinded him to the dangers, but even a more cautious commander would have been challenged by Hannibal that day. Paulus, the more experienced consul, was present and died fighting. He saw the trap closing and could not avoid it. Hannibal had created a situation where almost any Roman response would have led to disaster. This is perhaps the mark of true strategic genius, not just defeating a specific enemy in a specific way, but creating conditions where the enemy has no good options, where every move they make makes them more vulnerable, where the very logic that would normally lead them to victory leads them to defeat. At Cannae, Roman logic said, "We have numerical superiority. We must use it to crush the enemy center." This logic had worked in dozens of previous battles. But against Hannibal, this same logic became a death trap. The cold numbers of the battle tell only part of the story. 55,000 dead, 10,000 captured. These are not just statistics. Each number represents an individual life, a man who woke that morning, who put on his armor, who marched onto the field thinking of home, family, glory, and duty. Each had hopes, fears, dreams, and within hours they were all gone. The scale of the loss is difficult to truly understand. For context, this would be like losing over 500,000 soldiers in a single battle today, considering the relative population. Imagine the reaction of any modern nation to such a disaster. And yet Rome absorbed this blow and kept fighting. This resilience is as impressive as Hannibal's tactical genius. The Roman Senate could have asked for peace. They could have negotiated terms. After all, they had lost 3 major battles in a row: Trebia, Trasimene, and now Cannae. Their largest army had been destroyed. But they refused. Instead, they sent messengers to the allied cities, saying that Rome would fight to the end. They immediately began recruiting new armies, even arming slaves and criminals, something almost unthinkable for the Romans. They borrowed money, raised taxes, and used every reserve of resources they had. This determination came in part from the very structure of the Roman Republic. Rome was not ruled by a single king whose pride was tied to victory. It was governed by a senate of hundreds of men representing many powerful families. For Rome to surrender, all these families would have to agree, and many of them had lost members at Cannae. Instead of seeking peace, they sought revenge. Instead of accepting defeat, they doubled down on their commitment to war. This stubbornness, this refusal to accept what seemed like certain defeat, would ultimately be Rome's salvation. Hannibal remained in Italy for 13 more years after Cannae. During that time, he won some smaller victories, but he never managed to repeat the decisive success of Cannae. Part of the problem was that Rome had learned they would not give Hannibal another chance for a pitched battle on favorable ground. Roman generals became more cautious, more willing to avoid direct combat. They harassed Hannibal's supply lines, attacked his allies, and slowly regained territory. But there was another, more fundamental problem. Carthage was not properly supporting Hannibal. While Hannibal was in Italy performing military miracles with limited resources, the Carthaginian government was focused on other areas of war, particularly Iberia. Political groups in Carthage were jealous of Hannibal's success, fearing he was becoming too powerful. The reinforcements he desperately needed never arrived in enough numbers. His brother Hasdrubal tried to bring them across the Alps as Hannibal had done, but was defeated and killed at the Battle of the Metaurus before he could join Hannibal. Gradually, the strategic situation turned against Carthage. Rome conquered Iberia, cutting off the rich silver mines that paid for the Carthaginian war machine. Then a young Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had carefully studied Hannibal's tactics, convinced the Senate to allow him to invade Africa. It was a bold move that forced Carthage to recall Hannibal to defend his homeland. After 15 years in Italy, Hannibal finally left, having failed to achieve his ultimate goal of destroying Rome. The final battle between Hannibal and Scipio took place at Zama in 202 BC. For the first time, Hannibal was at a disadvantage. Scipio had the better cavalry, having made allies with the Numidians who had previously fought for Hannibal. Scipio had also learned from Cannae. He used a flexible formation that allowed Hannibal's war elephants to pass between his lines without causing damage. And when Scipio's cavalry defeated the Carthaginian cavalry and attacked Hannibal's rear, it was almost a mirror image of Cannae. Hannibal, the master of envelopment, was himself enveloped. It was a bitter defeat for the greatest general of his era. After Zama, Carthage was forced to accept harsh peace terms. They had to pay a huge amount of money, give up all territories outside Africa, and greatly limit their army and navy. Hannibal, trying to reform the Carthaginian government and make it more efficient to pay the debt, ended up making powerful enemies among the local aristocracy. Eventually, he was forced into exile. He spent his final years wandering from court to court in the Hellenistic world, serving as a military advisor to various kings, always avoiding Roman agents trying to capture him. Finally, trapped in a house in Bithynia with no escape route, Hannibal took poison. His last words were reportedly, "Let us free the Romans from their worry since they find it very tiresome to wait for the death of an old man." It's a deeply tragic story. Hannibal Barca was arguably the greatest military genius of ancient times. He was capable of seemingly impossible feats. He crossed the Alps with elephants. He repeatedly defeated larger Roman armies using brilliant tactics. He engineered the most perfect tactical victory in military history at Cannae. And yet he lost. He died in exile far from his homeland, hunted by enemies. His hometown would eventually be destroyed by Rome in the Third Punic War, with no stone left standing. His family, which had dedicated 2 generations to the war against Rome, was wiped out. Personally and nationally, it was a complete defeat. And yet, more than 2,000 years later, it is Hannibal's name that lives on. It is Cannae that military students study. It is the genius of his tactics that is admired. The names of the Roman consuls he defeated are largely forgotten, except as footnotes in Hannibal's history. There is an immortality in this. Hannibal lost a war, but he won history. His reputation as a military genius not only survived his defeat, but was actually enhanced by it, because it shows that even the greatest genius is limited by factors beyond his control: politics, economics, luck, and the broader currents of history. The secret weapon of Cannae, the double envelopment, wasn't really a weapon in the traditional sense. It was an idea executed to perfection. It was the understanding that battles aren't won by brute force alone, but by positioning, timing, and psychology. It was a realization that you can use your enemy's expectations and tendencies against them. The Romans expected a battle line to be straight and solid. Hannibal gave them a curved, flexible line. The Romans expected numerical superiority to mean victory. Hannibal turned their numbers into a problem. The Romans expected to advance and crush the enemy center. Hannibal let them do just that and then surrounded them from all sides. This central idea, using the enemy's expectations against them, is relevant far beyond the military battlefield. In business, politics, sports, and any competitive field, there are lessons to be learned from Cannae. When you understand how your opponent thinks, when you can predict their actions, you can create situations where every move they make weakens them. You can turn their strengths into weaknesses. You can make them defeat themselves. But there's also a counter lesson, the Roman one. Rome lost catastrophically at Cannae but won the war. Why? Because they had strategic depth. They had resources they could use. They had a resilient political structure that didn't collapse after a single disaster. They had the wisdom to learn from their mistakes and adapt their tactics. And crucially, they had the sheer stubbornness to refuse to give up. Rome absorbed a blow that would have destroyed almost any other nation and kept fighting, not because they were tactically unbeatable, Hannibal had proven they weren't, but because they were strategically deep and mentally resilient. There's a fascinating tension between these two lessons. On one hand, Cannae teaches us that tactical brilliance can overcome seemingly impossible odds. On the other hand, the overall outcome of the Second Punic War teaches us that tactical brilliance isn't always enough. You need long-term strategy, resources, political support, and allies. Hannibal had tactical genius. Rome had everything else. And in the end, everything else was enough. Imagine if Hannibal had had Carthage full support. If the reinforcements he repeatedly asked for had arrived, if his military successes had been matched by diplomatic successes in breaking the Italian Confederacy, if more Italian cities had joined him after Cannae, history might have been completely different. Rome might have been defeated. The course of Western civilization would have been fundamentally changed. there would have been no Roman Empire. There would have been no spread of Roman law, Roman engineering, or Roman culture. The entire later development of Europe and the Mediterranean world would have followed a different path. It's tempting to wonder what Hannibal was thinking as he looked out over the field of Cannae late that August day. The sun setting over a field covered with dead, tens of thousands of Roman bodies lying as far as the eye could see. His own victory so complete it was almost unreal. Did he know at that moment that despite this perfect victory, he would ultimately lose the war? Could he see the future where Rome would recover and eventually defeat him? Or did he still have hope that this victory would be the turning point, that Rome's allies would now turn against her in large numbers, that the Republic would collapse? We will never know. What we do know is that Hannibal continued fighting for another 15 years, showing remarkable courage and persistence in the face of increasingly impossible odds. There is a tragic greatness in this. Like Achilles in the Greek stories, Hannibal chose glory over safety, knowing it could lead to his destruction. He could have stayed in Carthage, lived a comfortable life, and died old and respected. Instead, he chose war, the impossible challenge of defeating Rome, and ended up hunted and exiled, dying by his own hand to avoid capture. The Battle of Cannae remains, more than 2,000 years later, the perfect example of what is possible when the human mind is applied to the problems of war with creativity and brilliance. It wasn't brute force that won that day. It wasn't superior technology. It was superior thinking. It was the ability to see possibilities others didn't. It was a courage to carry out a plan that, if it had gone wrong, would have resulted in disaster. It was a perfect coordination of different types of troops: heavy infantry, light infantry, heavy cavalry, light cavalry, each playing its role at precisely the right moment. In a very real sense, the secret weapon of Cannae was Hannibal's own mind, his ability to visualize the battlefield not as it was but as it could be, his understanding of human psychology, both that of his own soldiers and his enemies, his willingness to risk everything on a daring plan, and perhaps most importantly, his ability to communicate that plan to his officers and have them execute it flawlessly under the most stressful conditions imaginable. Because carrying out the plan of Cannae was not easy. The Gallic and Iberian infantry in the center had to retreat in a controlled way under enormous pressure, keeping formation even when being pushed back by Roman legions. This required tremendous discipline. The African infantry on the wings had to stay in position, not moving, while watching the center being attacked, waiting for the exact moment to turn and attack the Roman flanks. This required patience and confidence. The cavalry had to quickly defeat the enemy horsemen and then move behind the entire battlefield to attack the Roman rear at the precise moment. This required skill and perfect timing. Any of these elements could have failed. If the infantry in the center had broken instead of retreating in a controlled way, the trap would not have worked. If the African infantry had attacked too early or too late, the Romans could have adjusted. If the cavalry had not won its flank battles, they could not have closed the ring. Everything had to work perfectly. And it did. This flawless execution of a complex plan under combat conditions is as impressive as the plan itself. And so we come to the end of this extraordinary story. The secret weapon that destroyed 80,000 Romans at Cannae cannot be reduced to a single thing. It was a combination of tactical genius, perfect execution, a deep psychological understanding of the enemy, and a willingness to risk everything on a bold plan. It was the mind of a genius applied to the problem of war, creating a solution so elegant, so perfect in its geometry and timing, that it continues to be studied and admired more than 2,000 years later. The battle teaches us that numbers don't always win, that the larger side doesn't always win, that there is power in clever tactics, in thinking beyond convention, in seeing possibilities others consider impossible. But the broader war teaches us that tactical genius alone is not enough, that strategy beats tactics, that resilience and resourcefulness can overcome even the most disastrous defeat, that history is not made merely by individual moments of brilliance but by sustained effort over time. Cannae was a moment, a day, a few hours that changed everything. But it was just a moment in a war that lasted 17 years. And that war was just one chapter in the larger story of Rome and Carthage, two civilizations competing for control of the Mediterranean. And that competition was just one part of a much larger human story. Seen from this perspective, even the most perfect victory is just a dot on a much larger canvas. What a point! What a moment! When we speak of Cannae today, we're not just talking about an ancient battle. We're talking about what's possible when human creativity is applied to the most difficult challenges, about what can be achieved when one refuses to accept that the usual rules cannot be changed, about the power of seeing the world not as it is but as it could be. These lessons go beyond time, place, and context. They are as relevant today as they were 2,200 years ago. The secret weapon at Cannae was, in the end, the most powerful weapon humans have ever had. The human mind applied with creativity and brilliance to a seemingly impossible problem. And that's why we still talk about Hannibal and Cannae today. Not just because it was a great military victory, but because it represents something fundamental about human potential, about what we can achieve when we think differently, when we dare to challenge convention, when we have the courage to carry out ideas others consider impossible. This is a true lesson of Cannae. This is a secret weapon that destroyed 80,000 Romans. And this is why this battle, fought on a summer day over 2,000 years ago in a field in southern Italy, still echoes through the centuries, is still studied, and is still admired, because it reminds us of what is possible. And from this possibility, from this spark of human genius applied to the most difficult challenges, comes the inspiration that drives humanity forward generation after generation. As we think about these extraordinary events in human history, about Hannibal's genius and Rome's resilience, about victories and defeats, about greatness and tragedy, we are reminded of something greater. Behind all human plans, all strategy and tactics, all courage and ambition, lies a greater providence that governs the fate of nations and men. The ancient Romans believed in their gods, looking for signs and omens before every battle. But looking through the lens of history, we can see a deeper story unfolding. The Lord God, in his infinite wisdom, allows empires to rise and fall, battles to be won and lost, and the history of humanity to unfold according to his greater purposes. Hannibal had genius, but he did not have destiny on his side. Rome had flaws, but it had something more, the role it would play in the history of civilization, laying roads, laws, and eventually preparing the world for even greater events to come. May we, by studying these ancient stories, learn not only about strategy and warfare, but also about humility before the greater mysteries of history and the divine providence that guides the course of nations.